Welcome back to A Kitsune's Tale. Please make sure you catch the earlier chapters within the story if you have not done so already. Please comment, like, and subscribe for more content. Chapter 5. Dreams. I came face to face with my prey. It stood before me, mere inches from my nose. The red and white flames were replaced with a rolling mixture of blue and white. "Why do you follow me here?" The voice that whispered in my mind was the same as the one from the night of my quest. The difference lay in the seduction compelling me forward. It called to me, pulling me onward. I allowed it to draw me closer, my desire to know more feeding the firefox's hunger. I could again hear someone calling my name. I almost recognized the voice trying to tell me something. My concentration threatened to break as my subconscious mind strained to hear the distant voice. I began to fight the hunger of the firefox. It became a struggle of wills as we each fought for control. "Breathe," came the distant voice. An idea then struck me. I instantly switched tactics. Instead of resisting the entity, I decided to give myself over to it, to overwhelm the firefox as the rain overcomes a fire. I poured all that I was into it. Suddenly, a sharp pain made me gasp. I was so close that the unexpected gasp drew the essence of the fox into me. I opened my eyes to stare up at the night sky. My throat felt raw and burned. Concerned faces stared at me from all around, Fishra and Pasha among them. "What's going on?" My voice was raspy, and the effort to breathe felt like razors in my lungs and throat. Pasha urged me to be silent before instructing Fishra and someone else to carry me. My body ignited in pain, causing my muscles to convulse. The intense sensation was too much, and darkness overtook me once again. I found myself standing on the bank of a small river near the base of a waterfall. Across from me stood a red fox, observing me intently. I called out to it, but got no response. I scanned the river for a way to cross, but to no avail. I contemplated wading across, but decided against it. The current was too strong and the possibility of being swept away too great. The fox sat there temptingly, daring me to try against my better judgment. The creature's audacity, sitting there waiting for me to give in to my desires, incensed me. The longer I contemplated the situation, the more tempting it became to test nature's mercy. I took a step closer to the edge and the water surged. I eyed the fox accusingly. It had not moved. The river returned to its normal flow when I retreated a step. "Why are you doing this?" I yelled in agitation. I decided to sit while I puzzled out the situation. Pasha directed the two young bearers to place Kara in her quest chamber. She spread out a thick blanket for her to rest. She then bent down to examine Kara more closely once they had stepped back. Her small nose was hot, dry, and the skin felt like it was on fire. Pasha sent Fishra to fetch cool water and dismissed the other witnesses. They worked through the night, keeping Kara swathed in towels soaked in water. Fishra looked at Pasha, concerned. "What's wrong with her?" Pasha shook her head. "I'm not sure. I have never seen anyone go through this during a change." I spent hours contemplating the problem. I wasn't sure what was happening, but I suspected the firefox and the one facing me were related to the one I saw at Pasha's. Day eventually succumbed to night. The air grew colder and the wind began to cut through my robe. I got up to stamp my feet in a futile effort to warm my body. Hours passed excruciatingly slow as the night air grew colder. I began to pace while the fox continued to observe me quietly. To my dismay, I spotted small flakes of snow beginning to fall. The situation quickly deteriorated as the snow began to fall heavier until I could barely see. I sought cover beneath a small pine, which did little to shield me from the increasing wind and mounting snow. Within a short time, I lay shivering uncontrollably in nearly 3 feet of snow. The tree began to bend under the weight of the snow and ice until I could hear branches start to break in the distance. I thought feverishly of how I could keep from freezing. By now, my body had stopped shaking as it became numb to the cold. One of the limbs of my shelter snapped and fell to the ground with a thunderous crack, causing my mind to drift back in time to my mother reading a book in the living room of our house while I played with my doll by the fireplace. I remembered how warm it was by the fire while the winter storm howled outside. I stopped playing with my doll and glanced around the room in confusion. My mother was gone. To my horror, the room began to dissolve. The snow again began to build up around me. The only remnant of the living room was the fire that raged in defiance of the cold. I opened my eyes against the howling wind pressing in against me. The world was completely void of any color, save the blanket of white that swirled around me. Something inside me started to force itself to the surface. I tried desperately to identify the feeling. It reminded me of the heat I felt radiating off the firefox earlier. Realization finally struck me. I reached out with my furred hand and tried to channel the blue-white flame I remembered into my hand. Slowly, the numbness in my fingers was replaced with a tingling sensation that evolved into a burning discomfort as feeling began to return. I fed the fire in my mind. I had to shut my eyes against the light that blossomed in front of me. When I opened them, my arm was engulfed in the same blue-white flame. The wind and snow fought to overcome the blazing heat emanating from me without success. My whole body felt like it was covered in pins and needles as the flames spread throughout my body to rise to the surface, battling back the cold. I could hear the snow hiss as it hit my body, instantly evaporating in its futile attempt to penetrate beneath. Pasha woke to the sound of Fishra screaming from the other room. She hurried to see what had happened in her absence. She found Kara engulfed in a blue-white fire radiating all over her body. The heat from it had incinerated the blankets and even started melting the silver brazier filled with water beside her. She could only stare in shock as the intensity of the fire increased. She grabbed Fishra and pulled her aside in time to avoid the flame as it flared to fill the tiny room. This was beyond her understanding. Nothing she had ever seen or heard of could explain what she was seeing. Pasha grabbed Fishra and shook her to get her attention. "Go fetch Cano. She is his charge and he may know what to do." I rose to my feet and started out in search of the fox through the 3 feet of snow. It hissed and evaporated with every step that left a deep furrow in my wake. I came to the river's edge where I had seen the creature before. The melted snow began to freeze behind me as the cold was able to fill the space where my inflamed body had once been. Across the river was the fox, still sitting on the grass-covered bank. The visage across the river remained warm and inviting compared to the torment sweeping around me. "I will not give up," I shouted defiantly, but the fox's expression did not change. I took a step toward the frozen river. I watched as the ice melted and the water turned to steam and became a dense white fog, hiding the far bank from view. Another step, and I could hear the water boiling. When I stepped to where the river's edge should have been, I heard the hissing of evaporating water. The steam intensified, but I could not feel the heat from it that should have burned my skin. I pressed on, ignoring the sound of hissing and boiling water around me. Once across the river, I locked eyes with the little fox. It stared up at me through ice-blue eyes. It made no move to escape. I began to relax and could feel the fire within me begin to recede until it was eventually extinguished. "So, you have learned to control the fire within your soul," came the ghostly whisper. "Do you have it in you to quench your thirst for fire?" I reached out to touch the fox. The moment my fingers touched the red fur, it dissolved into a wisp of smoke that enveloped me briefly before vanishing. I opened my eyes to the dimly lit room of Pasha's questing chamber. Pasha was instantly at my side. "What happened? How did I get here?" My voice was barely a whisper against the silence of the dark room. Pasha produced a glass of water, which I tried to gulp down. It hit my dry throat, and I began to cough uncontrollably. I struggled against the strangling sensation, reaching out to grab Pasha's arm. "Help me!" I gasped. Before she could respond, I went limp and fell back to the floor. My head hit the scorched stone with an audible thump, and then nothing. This time I was in the middle of a desert. Above me, the sun loomed so close I felt I could almost touch it as it radiated heat like an inferno. I took stock of my surroundings but saw nothing but shifting sands in all directions. Nothing grew here. It was desolate, devoid of any life. In the distance, I could almost make out the shimmering figure of another fox. It was too far to make out any details, nor could I tell how far away it was. Knowing that the answers I sought could only be found when I reached the malevolent creature, I began the long trek toward it. I walked on in the sweltering heat. My fur only aided the sun in making my hands and feet sweat profusely. Not knowing where the impulse came from, but I began to pant. The air was still hot, but it helped slightly to cool my body. The longer I pressed on, the more tired I became. My throat became dry in short order, and I began to long for the snow-covered bank of the river. This world was the opposite extreme of the last. I wondered for the 100th time if the creature was trying to kill me. I stopped to gauge the distance of the fox and was dismayed to discover I was no closer to reaching it than when I started. I looked back and saw that my tracks continued out of sight. There was still no sign of life or shelter from the cruel heat. I finally came upon an object lying on the sand to my right. I stumbled over to examine it more closely. My eyes widened when I saw what looked like the skull of some small dog. It stood out brilliantly against the brown sand, bleached white from the scorching sun. Further examination revealed other pieces of white bone. At the end of an outstretched hand was the word thirst drawn in the sand. Realization finally struck me. My last test was a lesson in controlling the fire I had consumed from the firefox. The fox in my last test had used water in the form of ice and snow to teach me. Now that I had consumed the spirit in the previous lesson, this one was trying to teach me to control the essence of the other. I had no idea how I was supposed to control the flow of water in a world where none existed. I looked up at a clear sky filled with only the large, oppressive sun. I reached up to draw my fingers across my jaw in thought and felt them scrape roughly across my dry lips. I stared down at the shriveled, dry, cracked pads of my hand. I remembered from my health class at school that the body could only survive for a few days without water. Another memory interjected that if I was out in the desert heat, my condition would rapidly deteriorate. I did not think I had days. My guess was less than a day at most. Cano arrived, followed by Ceiro. He knelt beside Kara's still body to get a better idea of her condition. This does not look good. When was the last time she had anything to drink? Pasha stood out of the way, worriedly watching Kara. I tried to give her water right after she nearly burned down my home. To emphasize her point, she motioned to the empty glass lying broken on the scorched floor. She needs water! What are you waiting for? Cano growled at Pasha. Pasha stood her ground despite her desire to cower from the angered Lovenmensch. She nearly choked last time I tried to get her to drink. I do not think it is a good idea to try it again now that she is unconscious. I worked to fight back bouts of panic. I have to think clearly, I said aloud. I began the arduous task of trying to remember everything I had ever read about desserts, all the while continuing my trek to reach the fox. I could feel my energy beginning to leach away as I dragged along, every step becoming a struggle to stand upright. I eventually succumbed to exhaustion and dropped to my knees. My tongue felt thick in my mouth, preventing me from swallowing as it seemed to stick to the bottom. I attempted to wet my lips, but there was no moisture left in my mouth to accomplish the task. I noticed a red spot of blood drop onto the surface of the hot sand seconds before it was absorbed. I suddenly remembered that there were usually small rivers deep below the surface of the earth where it supposedly continued to flow. I placed my hands on the ground and closed my eyes, searching for the power of the water fox. It was there, dormant in the deep recesses of my mind. I struggled to coax it to the surface, it was so deep. After what felt like an eternity, the the power began to slowly surface. The effort it took to control it was rapidly draining my already depleted energy. I redoubled my efforts to draw it out, desperation becoming my only driving force. I could sense death was but a breath away, and so I held it as I struggled. I could feel my pulse pounding in my head, rapid and weak, the sensation becoming nearly unbearable. It became difficult to keep control of the power that was now surfacing rapidly. The sudden release of power left me lying on my back beneath the blazing sun, gasping for air, my legs folded under me. I could feel my body awash with cool, refreshing moisture. My tongue no longer felt swollen, and I was once again able to swallow. I opened my eyes to see the shimmering fox looking down at me as though contemplating a mouse caught in a trap. I lay in a shallow pool of water that soaked through my thick fur coat to the skin underneath. The weight of the world can be a terrible burden for such a small being. The shimmering fox crumbled to sand without another word. Kara inhaled deeply, then vomited the water she had tried to drink earlier. Cano and Ceiro rushed to her side to find her still unconscious. Cano rolled Kara onto her side to prevent her from choking further on the water. Once he was certain she had expelled the contents of the glass, he rolled her onto her back once more. When it was obvious she would not rouse, he returned to his book in search of an explanation. He was convinced the answer to what was happening to Kara could be found in one of his father's journals. Ceiro remained at her side, softly brushing the lengthening fur on her head. He longed to speak with Kara, to tell her more about her grandmother, things that only he knew. The wind blew around me as I stood on the narrow pillar of stone high above the world below. I had to brace against the increasing wind, threatening to knock me off to my death on the rocks below. This time the fox wavered in the air in front of me. As usual, it made no attempt to help me. I was, however, becoming accustomed to the tests it threw at me. There would be clues as to what needed to be done to pass. I just had to look for them. I set about the arduous task of solving the puzzle of how to keep from being knocked off my precarious perch. I could make out dark clouds in the distance that periodically flashed brightly. The closer they came, the stronger the wind howled. I looked around for some way to get down from my perch, though I had not expected an obvious solution, but had hoped. The wind built in strength, forcing me to lean into it while I dug my claws deep into the stone to keep from being toppled over. I squinted into the gale, studying the encroaching black clouds. I could clearly make out the white lines of lightning weaving through them, followed by a distant rumble. Now that I had discovered how the tests worked, events had started to speed up, making me think faster. My time would be brief in comparison to my other challenges. I began frantically searching for a solution. I could feel my grip slipping under the torrent as my claws dug trenches through the slick stone. My hands added some additional purchase as I crouched to grip the stone surface. My hair whipped back in the wind along with my tails. Had the situation not been so dire, the number of tails might have received more attention. The fur of my face swept back and occasionally rippled like straw-covered fields when the wind shifted slightly. Behind me, I could feel pieces of the pillar's edge give way under my weight, the falling stones echoing through the darkness below. I decided to inch back and over the edge to let the pillar shield me from the wind. Several times I nearly lost my hold and had almost fallen to my death, only to regain my grip inches later until I discovered a crack just big enough to partially hide from the storm. The storm reached me just as I gained a foothold and wedged myself into the crevice. I could hear the lightning strike the pillar above me over the roar of the wind, sending small chunks of rock bouncing off the top of my head and shoulders on their journey to the ground below. I watched as they tumbled out of sight, bouncing against the stone pillar throughout their descent into obscurity. I imagined my own body tumbling the distance to become smashed and broken as it struck the stone surface during its own journey to the bottom. The more the lightning struck the ledge above me, the more I was forced to give up my hiding place and try to climb down. I realized I needed more places to grip the stone. Slowly, an idea formulated in my mind. I tried focusing on the rock where I wanted to put my hands and feet, willing it to provide those places. I could feel my hands becoming slick and moist with effort. Had it not been for my claws, I would have surely slipped. It began to yield to my power, though hesitantly. The climb down was slow, and the rapid decay of the rock above threatened to overtake me. I worked harder to force my will on the stone. The ground shook as the side of the pillar began to crack open to reveal a fissure that provided the semblance of shelter where I could speed my descent. If only the bottom were closer, I would not have so far to climb. I gave up trying to control my descent, allowing myself to slide down the fissure rather than climb. I used my claws to control the speed at which I fell despite the pain. All around me, the surface of the stone continued to shake violently. Whether from the storm or from the fissure's formation was unknown. All my mind could focus on was the need for the ground below to come closer without smashing my body on it. I closed my eyes against the strain of maintaining my grip on the stone when I felt my feet encounter a solid, unmovable object. I opened them to find I had landed on a stone bridge that extended to a cliff edge beyond. I wasted no time running across the narrow space. I reached the cliff just as the pillar began to crumble under the fury of the storm, taking the bridge with it. Once it was reduced to a pile of boulders and dust, the storm began to subside. I turned to find the fox wavering in the air. The wind can be a powerful force that may overcome all before it. Even the mountain must bow before it. A gust of wind came from nowhere to knock me back to the ground. Everyone watched Kara curiously. She lay motionless, barely breathing. "How much more of this will she be able to endure?" asked Ceiro nervously. Cano frowned in response. "I have no idea. My father's journals do not say much about this, only that her grandmother experienced something similar that lasted 2 days. Cano laid his hand on her head to reassure himself. "At least she is no longer dehydrated. What worries me most are the changes. Look at her tails." 4 tails now lay splayed across the floor. According to Pasha, she had no tails when this all started. If she continues to develop at this rate, there may be dangerous times ahead. I shook my head to clear the haze that clouded sight and thought. It only served to make things worse. It was difficult to draw even the shallowest breath. I could neither see nor hear anything. I focused the slightest bit of power to create a tiny flame in my hand. It did little to help, and even seemed to make it harder to breathe. I searched the room to discover that I was now in an enclosed cavern. The difficulty lay in the fact that what little oxygen that existed was being used up by both the fire and my breathing. I released my hold onto the power, and the little fire flickered out, leaving me in total darkness. I slowly ran my fingers over the rock, looking for any cracks that might let in the air I hoped might be on the surface. My breathing became little more than gasps the longer I searched. I eventually found what I sought. The crack was so small that I nearly missed it. I tried to form a larger hole in the rock like I had in the pillar. I felt small tremors under my feet and even succeeded in making the crack a couple inches wider. It was becoming much more difficult to breathe. The concept of suffocating drove me to panic. Disembodied voices echoed around me, whispering despairing taunts. Even Zedra's voice whispered into my ear, "You are weak." I grabbed at whatever power I could find in my blind search for a solution. The ground shook violently, and I could even hear little drops of water hitting the ground. I tried to concentrate on the sounds. Something about water was important. The lack of oxygen only made it harder to think. My mind kept swirling, unable to focus on one thing. All that I could think of was throwing more energy into what I was doing until I could hear the water pouring onto stone in a rush. I continued my struggle until even my power abandoned me and I lay gasping for the non-existent air. This is it. Game over, I thought. I wish there were something to help me, something I could control. I let my head drop to the floor to splash in the shallow pool of water that had gathered. My head continued to swim, and I struggled to stay awake. She's not breathing! Cano, help! Pasha put her ear over Kara's mouth to listen. Nothing. Even when she tried to force air into her lungs, her chest refused to rise. Cano came running into the room but could only stare in horror. Even the usually calm Ceiro looked terrified. There was nothing more they could do for her beyond what Pasha had tried, but stand a sad vigil as life drained from Kara. They lacked the power or knowledge to help her. Tears rolled down Pasha's cheeks to land on Kara's face. She tried to breathe for Kara again, but it had the same effect. "Can't you do something? You're supposed to be an all-powerful mage," she screamed at Cano. Pasha continued to lean over Kara's still body as the tears fell from her nose unabated. I lay there waiting for death to take me. One clear thought kept surfacing. If only the water would stop splashing on my face and let me die in peace. I used the last ounce of energy I had to roll over with my face in the water, and I received a lungful of it when I gasped for air. Of course! The lungful of water brought realization to me, though I struggled to cough it up. The body needed residual air to expel foreign objects. Something about breathing the water reminded me of my chemistry class. Water was made of oxygen and hydrogen. I lifted my face out of the water, still trying to cough. It took the last of my will to fill my lungs with air, but I succeeded if just. It was enough, however, to allow me to cough up the bit of water I had inhaled. The more I breathed, the more my head cleared. I could once again feel the energy inside me start to build. I used it to draw even more oxygen from the water. I felt the odd sensation of something other than air filling my lungs. I had the suspicion that I had passed the test and now possessed essence of the fox. I rekindled the flame in my hand. This time it shone brightly enough to cast out any darkness that tried to hide in the crevices of stone. I could now see the dimensions of my prison. I was indeed trapped in a small cavern of rock. How do I get out of here? How do you wake from a dream? Asked the familiar voice. You mean it is as simple as waking up? There was no response. I wished I was awake. I wanted so much for the nightmare to be over. I tried pinching myself, but that didn't work. I imagined waking up in my room back home. Nothing happened. I recalled how I had woken up the times I had passed out after a test. Fatigue quickly overcame my body. I wanted nothing more than to simply sleep,